My guest today is Andy West.
I'm retired now. My training was originally in physics, and I spent about 40 years in the electronics industry, mostly on the software side. But for decades, I've been very interested in originally evolutionary processes, which led to cultural and social evolution, and eventually, how do cultures work? And by cultures, I mean religions or ideologies. And so that's been occupying my time for the last 15 years or so. And eventually I stumbled upon the fact that there is a culture operating in the climate change domain.
All right. And today we're going to be talking about your book, The Grip of Culture, right? Subtitle, The Social Psychology of Climate Change Catastrophism. And I've been reading that book, and a lot of good stuff in there. So where do you want to start there?
I guess we should start because I guess we'll have a general audience with what it isn't, because quickly people make assumptions about books that have climate change in the title or whatever, and what it isn't is it doesn't go into anything to do with physical climate change at all, and nothing to do with the positions of the science really either, like the skeptics, the mainstream, whatever. It's purely a work of social psychology, but that social psychology happens to be independent of what's going on in the physical climate or the science. It has long since traveled its own road, shall we say. It's emergent. And so the book doesn't need to refer to the physical climate situation or the state of climate science to describe the social psychology of the domain, because it has long ago become independent. So it does describe the social psychology of that domain, and it describes it from the from the roots upwards. Why do people get involved in ideologies and religions? And we've done that for hundreds of thousands of years. Evidence for religions goes back, and it's a behavioral thing. It's deep in our evolution, and it's a mechanism to keep groups together, because humans in big groups survive better than when they aren't. And it's the group glue, and it bypasses intelligence, sadly. So that's why cultures often seem so irrational, because they literally are. This stuff goes around our rationality, and they have signatures that you can look for.
All right. And I think I heard you say elsewhere that there might be 200 definitions of culture, but can we think religion or ideology when we're first getting into this and get the basic thrust, or what should we do to?
Yeah. I mean, there's loads and loads of definitions of culture, even in academia, never mind in colloquial language. But yeah, what I mean is a cultural entity. So a bounded social movement, or a religion is the best example, because they're all the oldest ones. You can kind of draw a bound around it. You know where that religion is. You know who believes in it and who doesn't. They all wear funny clothes, or whatever it happens to be. If it's communism, they all hate capitalism, and so on and so forth. So it's a bounded social movement. It has very specific characteristics. It has a consensus through the believers about what is true. And another thing that's an interesting characteristic of it is that the main narrative is always wrong. The main narrative has to be wrong in order for the thing to fulfill its purpose, which is to glue everybody together. Because if it approached the truth too nearly, then it can be questioned by reason and by logic, which could slowly dismantle it. So in fact, the further away it is from reality, the better. So for instance, in Christianity, you've got Jesus died to save us from our sins, or something like that. It's a fairy story. In communism, you've got capitalism is evil. Well, that's a fairy story too. It might be bad, bits might be bad, bits might be good, but it's not pure evil. And in climate catastrophism, there is an imminent, which is to say decades, global climate catastrophe. And the mainstream science does not say this is true, and neither does the skeptic science either. All the science positions do not say that's true. So the cultural narrative fits the bill. It's false, and they're all false. They're all fairy tales, and that's the way the culture works relies on being false.
Right. So, in your book, you have this fascinating thing about just thinking about Professor Caruso being marooned for 35 years and then being told that there was a climate change narrative. Or what did he say? Oh, he was told the whole world is now hugely worried about man-made climate change. Had been
Yes.
spending trillions on the issue, but knowing nothing else, he could come up with a list of 24 things about this the narrative. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. People who normally research these things would be familiar with a lot of the characteristics and how these characteristics sort of show themselves in society. And it's only bias in the social sciences that prevents people from seeing all these things. If this Professor Crusoe on his island was stranded for so long, he's not biased about climate change. He's never heard of it. So when the sailors pick him up, he knows instantly that all these things they come out with in describing it are cultural things. So like the consensus provokes statements that are all explainable, indisputable. It's classic culture. There'll be adoration of certain authority figures, possibly to the state of even prophet status. So we have Al Gore, and we have Greta Thunberg, and a raft of others. Key information that to do with the cultural narrative will be guarded or restricted. So like the ClimateGate thing, when they were trying to restrict information. There'll be approval ratings or hierarchy in society of those who are the cool guys and those who are the bad guys, and associated with them those activities. So being vegan is cool and eating meat is not cool. And there is demonization of anyone who questions the narrative. And so there's a whole chapter on how the modern term denierism is a misframing, and its main purpose is to demonize people without it looking like demonization. It looks like you're saying, well, they don't believe in science, or they don't believe in something like that. It's just straight demonization. And so a whole raft of these things, undermining morals, undermining the law, so on and so forth. And so the professor would know all these things, and he would instantly say, hey, there's a culture operating here. But the current social sciences are they're not investigating it in that manner, because typically they're biased by they think that global climate catastrophe is an output of hard science. So it's not that they're lying, they're not deliberately trying to avoid the thing, they're not, but it's a bias. And in thinking that is the case, then they don't investigate it as a culture. In fact, most of the time in climate psychology is spent trying to figure out why deniers deny and why they're all horrible and nasty, and which is a complete waste of time, because they're not denying. Most reaction against climate change in publics is innate skepticism. So it's instinctive, it's not rational, and it's because people have correctly picked up that it's being driven by a culture. And we have an instinct. We know we should know when cultures are driving things. And the reason we have that ability is so that we can throw out competitive cultures to our own. And in our own culture, it turns that ability off. So we can't see inside one that we believe in, but we can see other ones that try and that's what turns the public off.
I think you have mentioned elsewhere that you had no real opinion on climate change until you saw An Inconvenient Truth. And then you found all sorts of elements of culture in there rather than science. Do I have that right?
You do. It really smacked me in the face. I mean, I kind of knew about climate change back in 2006 and before, and I'd heard it come out. I didn't have any reason to disbelieve it. I wasn't particularly interested because I was interested in other things, but I thought at some point, well, this is going to get big. We'll have to do something at some point. But I didn't really investigate it much or anything. And anyway, somebody gave me a present, which was the CD of An Inconvenient Truth. And after a while, I watched this, and I was absolutely gobsmacked. It struck me straight away. It wasn't the climate information in there. I didn't know it was true or false. I didn't really care. What struck me is that it's absolutely packed full of emotive cultural memes and cultural language. And to the point that whatever was being said about the science will be completely overwhelmed by the emotion and in the message. And they effectively it's an apocalypse narrative in essence. And I thought, how on earth, because I was interested in these things, cultures, I thought, how on earth, there's been one staring me in the face all this time, I didn't even know it was there. So I then began to be very interested. And that's when I first started investigating the situation. But I haven't investigated anything to do with physical climate change or even climate science and the various positions that held. I have to know enough. You need to know the furniture of a domain before you can investigate the psychology behind it. So I had to get familiar with the arguments and so on. So having a degree in physics is at least enough to make me familiar with the arguments. So I know what the furniture of the domain is, but it's not the physics and the actual climate science that interests me. It's the psychology, and it quite quickly became apparent that the psychology that in mass publics, which we can measure because there's endless amounts of surveys on publics. So, which is great because we have loads of free data that tells us what's going on. And it quite quickly became apparent that the psychology of publics around the globe is completely independent of what's happening in science and what's happening in the physical climate. It has just gone its own way, just like a religion or an ideology, and it's following all those characteristics. And if you like, it's not really connected to what happens in the climate anymore. That's kind of completely secondary.
You've mentioned that you've seen examples of maybe history not repeating itself, but maybe rhyming. There's this whole idea now we can kill cattle to prevent the apocalypse. There was this deal in 1856 in Africa where they actually did kill the cattle. Do you want to mention that incident? Yes.
There was it was a nation called the Xhosa in South Africa, and they hadn't been colonized. They were kind of next to the main colonization phase, and they still lived independently, and their economy was based on cattle. And but they were under pressure from the colonies, and also under a lot more pressure when a lung disease struck their cattle. And so as societies can sometimes get, they were all a bit worried and what was going to happen, blah, blah, blah. And there's a lot of political rivalry as well between various chiefs in these Xhosa. And anyway, that's often when people turn to religion, and a number of prophets surfaced. And these prophets had a religion that was a cross between Christianity that had come from Europe and some native religions. And there was a sequence of these prophets, and they ended with one called Nonculus, who was a 16-year-old girl. And she had more credibility. A lot of the other prophets before had been adults, and some of them had been outright warmongers who said, we should attack the Europeans, blah, blah, blah. But she wasn't a warmonger. She was innocent. She was a 16-year-old girl. And she said, everybody in the Xhosa nation has to slaughter their cattle. They have to destroy their seed stores, pull down their enclosures and build new ones. And if and only if this is done, then there'll be a renewal of the whole culture, and new cattle and new seed will magically come from somewhere. I'm not quite sure where. Heaven, I suppose. And everything will be great. And not all the chiefs believed her, but she had an uncle who was very high in the hierarchy, and she got the word of the main king eventually. And most of the nation, by and large, they followed this advice. They slaughtered all their cattle, they ditched all their seed, they destroyed their enclosures, blah blah blah. And surprise, surprise, the whole nation collapsed. There was tens of thousands of people starved, and those who got through it eventually were dispersed. They had to go and work in the European colonies for wages because their land was, they couldn't get started on their land anymore. They had no capital. So that the whole nation effectively destroyed itself through this religion, and it's what's called a millenarian religion. That there's the name for those things, that they predict a great change, and they want to distance themselves from everything current. And climate change has definitely got a strong millenarian wing, of which Greta is originally was also a 16-year-old girl prophet. And one of the giveaways of it is, you know, if you suggest a solution that might combat what climate change is supposed to be about, like nuclear, then the millenarian wing of this culture, climate catastrophe, they reject nuclear too, because what they're really after is the renewal of the whole society. They want everything's got to be refreshed, everything's got to be renewed. We cannot have anything that smells of the old society. And nuclear is technology. It's bad, you know. So a good test of how the millenarian wing of climate catastrophe is doing relative to what you might call the more central wing is how bad is anti-nuclear feeling, and it's pretty bad in some places. I mean, Germany are turning theirs off despite being in deep trouble regarding their energy supply after the problems with Russia and with the cost of that. And they're turning off their final power stations as we speak, nuclear, and they don't intend to ever turn them back on. And that is a millenarian response.
So there's this idea that the culture does what's best for the culture and not for humans. So do you think wind and solar are the preferred solution because they're not actually a solution and it keeps the problem going? Something perverse absolutely. Like that is going on.
Yeah, absolutely. The culture does promote its own interests. I mean, obviously, this can mean, like with the COSA, it could end up destroying the culture because it's destroyed its hosts. So there are mechanisms to potentially stop cultures doing that, but unfortunately, they don't always work, and they can take out their own host, and they do opt for solutions that will keep the culture going. So have endless resource, time, effort, and narrative, especially. Everybody talking about it. Cultures thrive on emotive narrative, which is all to do with renewables. Everywhere you look, there's renewables. It's soaking up money, it's soaking up effort, it's soaking up narrative. Everybody's talking about it. It provides bugger all amount of the actual power, and it probably couldn't ever be a solution because it's destabilizing grids and so on and so forth. Whereas nuclear actually could be a solution, and so the culture is very much behind renewables. It can never work. If culture picked a solution that would work, that would kill the culture. The culture is never going to do that of its own bat. There might be rational people fighting the culture or who partially believe, but if it was all left to the pure culture, it was never going to implement a solution that would kill itself. So cultures never do that.
So you have a great quote here. I'm going to quote you. Effectively, wind turbines are closer to cathedrals than they are to a power station. I think James Dellingpole calls them eco-crucifixes. Do you want to talk about that concept?
Yeah. Eco-crucifix is quite a good one, but the problem is you can be more emotional. You've got to try and avoid being as emotive in return. But a cathedral is less emotive, but they essentially are. And so, for instance, cultures have certain patterns which you can detect with attitudes, but those patterns, because policy tends to follow attitudes of each country, you can also figure out. So, for instance, the biggest single predictor of renewables across nations is actually national religiosity. There's an anti-correlation. So the more religious a country is, the less renewables it will have. And this is because there is an interaction between climate catastrophism and religion. It's a dual interaction, so it's a bit hard to describe. But as an outcome of this, then you can use national religiosity to measure how much renewables a nation will have, and it's pretty good. It's a pretty good predictor. But that is bonkers if you think about it. It should be dependent on things like, well, the climate or climate exposure of the nation, maybe, or on technical issues. I mean, just one irony out of this is that by a historical accident, irreligion, so atheism, if you like, irreligion has spread outwards from very cloudy nations in Northwest Europe. And as it's spread outwards, it with some exceptions, it's tended to have gone to sunnier climes. So there happens to be the correlation between cloudiness and religion. And because there's also an interaction between climate catastrophism and religion, this historical accident means there's far more solar deployed in cloudier countries, the commitment to solar is far higher in those countries than it is in sunny countries. You know, it's like, which is the exact opposite of what you would expect if it was rationality or technical issues that were actually determining how solar was deployed. But it's essentially the same for wind and solar. It's got a complete cultural pattern across nations. It has there's no rationality to it at all.
Do you want to talk about briefly what the central point in your book is about the correlation between religiosity in a country and how they answer the question of, do you think there's going to be a climate catastrophe? Isn't that what it's about, or part of it?
Yeah. The heart of the book is measurements, measurements of a culture. And yes, but you can measure a culture by asking questions in lots of different ways. And two of the main ways you can ask questions are unconstrained. So you asked a question like, are you going to be harmed by climate change? You know, or how serious do you think climate change is? You know, is it not that serious, really serious, extremely serious? So these are unconstrained questions. You know, do you think the UN will be able to fight climate change? That's an unconstrained question. And then there are constrained questions. So what I call reality constrained questions. It's where the question is asked in a manner which forces you to try and connect it to reality in some way. So like, what priority would you give fighting climate change against, say, I don't know, money for education or the economy or whatever? Or or how much would you pay to for this climate change related policy? How many dollars per month would you pay? These are two ways of introducing reality. And the really interesting thing is that you get completely different responses across nations for unconstrained questions as you do for reality constrained questions. The unconstrained ones correlate really, really strongly with religion, and they so the climate change most endorsing. So the ones that you go endorse climate change with your answers. Those answers are very low in secular countries and really high in religious countries. And the climate change most endorsing responses for reality constrained questions. So like, yeah, I'm going to give it a high priority or whatever. That they're quite high in secular nations, but extremely low in religious nations. So you have almost a cross pattern with these two, and yet they're both measuring climate change most endorsing responses. So how can that be? And the reason is to do with the fact that cultures are fundamentally hypocritical. But there's a relationship between religion and climate catastrophism. So, for instance, all the religious leaderships have statements on climate change, and it's pure catastrophe narrative. There's an appendix in the book that shows all those for every religion, and that's what happens is that makes their flocks, if you like, and much more comfortable with this narrative, and that's why you get positive answers in religious countries for unconstrained questions. Because is climate change going to harm you? Yeah, my religious guy says the climate change is going to harm me, so it's going to harm me. But when it switches to reality constrained questions, because these people are religious, and so far the alliance with climate transformation hasn't drilled down into their really deep values yet, they flip out of the alliance. They actually say, no, this thing is, I'm not going to give this thing a priority over my religious values or what my religious values say I should spend money on. So it completely goes into reverse. And all the people who really, so you might get, do you think climate change is gonna harm you and yours? In a religious country, a really religious country, you might get 60% will say yeah. And then you say, well, how much priority will you give it? Will you give it, let's say, priority over the economy or in schools? Like less than 10% of people say yes. That's a huge change. And in the secular countries, it's in reverse. It's not quite as strong, but the ones who say it's going to harm me and mine are actually really low, because the secular countries don't actually buy into the emotive side of it. But they actually give it more because they believe in science, and this thing says it's science. Then they actually give it more for less emotive narratives that are reality constrained. They'll give it a higher priority as against, say, education or other threats or whatever. So, and this is a classic cultural pattern. And asking these questions of a culture. I mean, we need, unfortunately, we have to use religion to see climate catastrophism, because you need another culture to see it. But for religion, we can actually perform the same function on religion itself. So we can actually ask religiously orientated questions about religious values and measure those against religiosity. So effectively, instead of interrogating climate catastrophism, we're then interrogating religion, and you get the same patterns. So you get exactly so. So in other words, you've got the same patterns from climate catastrophism, i.e., these crisscross patterns that you get if you interrogate religion, and you get them because they're both cultures. And and not only that, the entire of academia has completely missed these patterns. There's a whole literature that searches for what's called social predictors to climate change. So like, age, sex, education, but also more complex things at the national level as well as the individual level. So how many civil liberties a nation has, for instance. I mean, I kid you not, one of the things that's been tried is how many climate scientists there are in each nation. It's just unbelievable. And they've been doing this such a long time that there's really complicated statistical techniques now and loads of these variables. And they still have, even in groups, they still have very low predictive power, not usually getting beyond 20%. But the single national predictor of national religiosity can, for some of these attitudes, you can get up to 80%. And for the ones where we expect linearity, it's very rarely beyond 35%. And that's more or less where the entire of academia stops and where this single predictor begins. So it's been entirely missed. And the reason it's been missed is, again, bias. That nobody's looking for a culture. Otherwise, they would have spotted it really easily.
So do you think anybody from within the climate culture, do you think they'll read your book and learn anything, or they'll just dismiss it anyway, and you're mostly going to be speaking to people outside of the culture? Or how does it look?
That's a great question. One I've talked to my editor about, because in theory, if everybody in the academic field that was looking at what drove attitudes to climate change, and indeed all the mainstream pollsters that did all these surveys, knew what was in this book, it's just such a radical improvement on everything they're getting. You'd say, well, really, how could they carry on in the old way once they knew this was true? But but the problem is, if the book gets smeared for being a work of denial, well, nobody will ever read it. So the fact that this massive, it's almost the number of papers that are checking out attitudes to climate change. And I ought to mention that one thing I do agree with the literature on is that America is different because of the polarization there. But so most of the stuff concentrates on outside of the US now, because inside the US, where all the work was before, you get polarization between Dem Libs and Repcons. And it turns out that that's cultural as well. But to a first approximation, you don't need to know the climate culture. There's actually 4 cultures up in there. There's Repcons, Dem Libs, religion, and climate catastrophism. But to a first approximation, it just looks like the first 2. So people think it's political, and so they don't need to acknowledge the climate catastrophism. But everywhere else outside of America, this is where the vast amount of complexity appeared. And I think probably we can show a diagram, the spaghetti diagram, I call it,
okay.
Where that's how the literature thinks the domain is in terms of influence. It's a pile of spaghetti about hundreds of influences that map all over the place, and it's really difficult to work out. And the equivalent model for me is the 2 circles at the panel B at the bottom. Okay, you've got religion, you've got climate change. Predict one from the other. So you get rid of all these plates of spaghetti, and you're just left with that simple model. But what it comes down to is how will people in that academic industry or in the pollsters, I've tweeted some at them, how will they ever access those facts? Because it's so, the thing about cultures is they prevent you reading information in the first place by smearing it, by saying, it comes from these guys are bad. So the problem is, would they ever read it? I would defy anybody who does read it. They might still say my explanations are rubbish, fine. But even if my explanation is rubbish, this is really simple data, linear series only. It's like it comes from loads and loads of completely independent sources. Anybody can type it into to Excel and push the button and get these correlation and anti-correlation values out. Anybody could do it, like a first-year student could do it. And so, it has correlation values that massively exceed these super complex models with their massive statistics. How I defy anybody to say, they might disagree with my ideas, but you cannot read that and go back and say that, carry on trying to measure it the old way. You just can't.
What are the biggest specific takeaways for people of us outside of the climate cult to try to end it and bring sanity back to the world? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Yeah, I've got some stuff in my chapter at the end, but the problem is cultures are really, really hard to stop. I mean, I think it's far worse, for instance, than, I mean, conspiracies and petty power and control and greed, they can ride the back of a culture. So you can see them, but it's not causal. And you're facing something far worse than a conspiracy, if you like, if you're facing a culture, because they can subconsciously link billions of people. There's a billion Catholics, and they can link that. There's no way a conscious conspiracy can do it. So it's way more powerful than that. And that's what makes it really, really hard. Everybody conspires to make everybody else blind in a culture. And that's why they might never read the book, because they all tell each other that it's really bad, even though it turns out none of them have ever read it. But they all think that somebody's read it and it must be really bad. And that's how they prevent any awkward information getting out. And they are really, really, really difficult to beat. But the one thing that I mean, I thought maybe it could be shamed to death. So the very nasty culture in 1930s, Germany and Central Europe. In the end, okay, there's a massive war, but in the end, there was still quite a lot of people believed in eugenics, which was its equivalent for its rooting in science, if you like. That was its justification in science. And it was only when all the films came out of the camps that effectively that was shamed to death. It took a few years to fizzle out, but it was shamed to death. Nobody wanted to believe it anymore because it was just too horrible. And I thought, well, could you shame climate catastrophism to death? There is a lot of very embarrassing data. I mean, Michael Moore's film, which we might regard as a heretical brand of the faith, if you like, because he believes very, very much in climate catastrophe. He just doesn't believe that stuff is ever going to solve it. And there's stuff that came out about, how these things are destroying the environment and destroying children and destroying everything you practically think of and putting poison everywhere. This is embarrassing. But the culture pretty much shrugged it off. It pretty much said, no, we're not going to listen to that. We're going to censor it. We're going to get rid of that guy, even though he was on their side. And it hasn't really made a dent. I mean, no, you never hear of that film anymore, really. And it's practically something without trace. And yet it was a fundamental attack on what is supposed to be the biggest thing for the salvation. So maybe even shaming it to death, maybe it's shameless. So we can't find anything to shame it. So it's really tough. And the other thing that might is that cultures do yield to reality. If they didn't, even though their main narrative is completely fictional, they have a lot of buffers between that and reality. And so because they do have to accommodate reality to some degree. If they didn't, they wouldn't still be around in that population. And so if you present culture with real stuff, it gives as much as it has to, but no more. And that's why those reality constrained trends on the graphs, they go down and down and down, the stronger the reality gets. The culture gives what it has to, but no more. So, even before the war in Ukraine, then we already had an energy crisis, and there is definite movement in the population. The realities are becoming more clear. It's getting harder, I think, for the culture to still say, we got to have net zero across the board. When the war came along, it was even harder still. And I think it is giving ground, and it's giving ground because it has to. Because in the end, it can have an unreal narrative, but it can't literally face reality down if reality chooses to raise itself. But it will only retreat as much as it needs to. if it can back off enough to keep society going, to not actually collapse, which is a possibility with if you really did at net zero how the most ardent want it, then society would probably would collapse. But if it can back off sufficiently to keep society alive, but not let go of its believers, then that will at least force it to back off. And I think, there are hard realities that are definitely going to force it to back off. The problem will be, is it going to still keep its grasp on enough people and enough for it to not, what we really would like, for it to completely collapse? But that may not happen. It may just yield the ground it has to stay alive. And that's more tricky, because some rationality will be there, and yet every time it gets a chance, it will leap back in and push the boundaries again. And who knows how long it's going to last? I mean, I figured, because it's picked science as its narrative, someday that's going to go wrong, you would have thought. But when? And you look at some of the big cultures, well, they've lasted for 2 millennia. And so, and another thing you've got to worry about, in a way, it's a kind of worry, is it actually might have an upside. And I find that even more worrying in a way, because it's so heavy at the moment. But cultures did have huge upsides. That's why we evolved to have them. It glues all these people together. But what if it's the case that because we are so complex now and our technology is so complex, that we, using rationality, we simply aren't able to look after the planet, and only by making it instinctive could we do so. Now that would be bad, because that means you would need this instinct. So when it's more, maybe when climate change is more tamed, when it's backed up a bit, when it's realized that we can't have sackcloth and ashes for everybody, which Christianity realized before it and all the others realized before it, and it's made some compromises, maybe it would have an upside, and that upside might be something it's instilled in as an instinct not to kill the planet. But I'm just speculating there. And right now, I can't see anything that's good about this culture. It's just real bad and very hard to defeat. So...
On a different podcast, you mentioned that there were one or more climate cultures in the past in what is now Peru, and they ended badly. Can you talk about the details of what happened there?
Yeah. There was they had these they're in the way of El Nino type events occasionally. They caused this was in some valleys in Peru, and there was big flooding in these valleys every time there was an El Nino or something. I can't remember whether it's El Nino or La Nina, which way around it is, but they were subject to these things on a kind of not quite decadal basis, but enough to be remembered by grandchildren, that sort of area. And these floods would typically like wipe out a whole tribe at once or something. They're pretty serious. And I think they practice farming on these levels going up hills, I think. So it tends to get flooded out. So anyway, so they developed religions which effectively worshipped the weather, because they figured, well, the weather is all powerful. It's the weather. We live or die by the weather here. And one of these biggies comes along, we're toast. So and they built these step pyramids that are typical of the South America type thing, and they're really huge. And the elite lived at the top of this pyramid, and the elite, probably sacrificed a few virgins or whatever to this religion, and that kind of thing, and told the people, don't worry, it's going to be all right. You just keep paying us, and the elite will sort it for you. And and the reason that pyramids were so high is they're meant to look, because they knew that the weather came from the map, because they see this cloud falling down the mountains and lightning. So they figured it. They tried to make man-made mountains to be nearer to the source of the weather, and that's why these things are so big. Anyway, it never worked, of course, because and the next climate phase is going to come along, wipe them out just like it always has. So what tended to happen then is that the people got very angry, and they marched up the pyramid and killed all the elite and burnt all their things down, and said, right, we're going to have not any more of that. But unfortunately, what things then sort of recovered, and people, these people really, really knew how to make bricks and pyramids, and so they were soon making bricks and pyramids again. And elite, the whole thing went round again, and the archaeologists have seen that there's been a number of these burnings on the top of these pyramids, and I think it's because each time, the same thing happened. They couldn't predict, they couldn't stop the weather, So anyway, it looks like these guys basically were executed. Well, I don't think we should execute the current climate elite. We fortunately belong in that, but we perhaps should not believe that they can change the weather. As I say, my book's about psychology. It's not about climate change, so I don't know whether who's right in the physical climate debate. But I sure as hell know that if a culture tells you this, it's wrong, because all cultures are wrong, and they cannot solve it. So the prophets of this culture, the Al Gores, the Greta Thunbergs, who don't say anything that's even remotely backed up by mainstream science. So if you go away, read the working group papers, they don't say we're going to have a global climate catastrophe. It's a cultural narrative. Then we should not believe those narratives, and we should not believe that elite. And those pyramids are still there. When the Spanish first invaded, they're so large and they were all grown over. They thought they were hills, and eventually they realized they were man-made. So they're still there from an old climate change culture.
All right, I'm going to do the best I can to read part of a paragraph from your book, because I think it's very key. You're talking about the crazy climate policies, et cetera. And you say these are not the result of a hoax or conspiracy or delusion or greed or mental flaws or mendacity or nefarious intent. But they do not arise from rational processes either. Instead, they are ultimately a function of emotive reactions deep within our subconscious. Such reactions are typically felt both passionately and honestly. They are also completely and utterly normal. You want to talk about that? That's very interesting.
Yeah. I think that's that sort of philosophy has caused me a lot of grief in there, because it's very tempting for people to think what's happening now is not normal. Well, but it is. It happens throughout the whole of history, and although hoaxes and conspiracies and greed can ride on the back of cultures, as I said earlier, they aren't causal. The cause of this is something way bigger and way more harder to stop. And it's these emotive behaviors in us. And so the narratives appear, they're emergent. The most emotive ones get told more, so they get more and more emotive. And then they switch on these hot buttons, and those hot buttons bypass rationality. So that's why it's not, the main cause is not, it's not mendacity, it's not greed, because the most of the people who believe, the vast majority of people who believe, they believe in honestly. And you can see it in their eyes from a lot of these passionate climate people, that they're just stop oil guys on the street or whatever. They absolutely believe it. They completely believe it. They're not lying. And that is true of most of the elite who are pushing it as well. They don't, Figueres or whatever his name is, didn't come out with climate is boiling. He may think I'm exaggerating a bit, but I'm on the right side of history. I believe this. He's not lying. He's believing. And it is way worse to fight believers than liars. For liars, all you got to do is point out they're lying, right? End of story. That's no good with believers, because they believe their belief, and they think that anybody who's attacking that belief has got to be zany, But the thing is, they're not zany either. This is a thing that all humans do. It's happened forever, and it's a bypass of our rationality for strong beliefs. And unraveling that strong belief is really, really difficult. But it's actually it's the wrong target to think, right, this is all deliberate. It's all a conspiracy theory. These people planned this whole thing from the very beginning, starting with the Club of Rome and so on. Yes, the Club of Rome happened and so on and so forth. These were the early days of the culture when it was seeding itself. Those people didn't deliberately say, by 30 years, I'll be able to have stock petrol cars or whatever. It didn't happen like that. It's an emergent phenomena, and it carries everybody with it. And the people who were starting it, they believed in all the previous generations of memes. So they believed in all Paul Ehrlich's stuff, and at one stage, quite a few of the believers quite literally moved from we're all going to die from climate change because it's cold, like Stephen Schneider and so on. He was literally a warrior for it's going to be, an ice age. And he quite smoothly transitioned to be a warrior for global warming without any apparent hypocrisy at all. And that's because these things aren't rational. It's the belief system, the belief that humans are screwing the planet. That's the problem. the climate catastrophe is ultimately quite an anti-human religion, if you like. And so it's not that some of the early climate conferences didn't set out some rational things. The problem is the culture is in charge of their rationality. So they can do apparently rational things, but the cultural drive is upstream of their rationality. So they're doing intelligent planning. It's a bit like Joseph Goebbels, who had all his stuff. He was one of the greatest propagandizers ever, obviously. Yeah, if you read his diaries, he literally said, "I'm in love with Hitler. I love Hitler." And the thing is, he believed it all himself. He believed whatever came out of Hitler's mouth. So he's using his great intelligence to figure out how to advance the narrative and make it better. But he's doing it because he believes in it, not because he doesn't believe in it. It's not hypocritical in a conscious sense. It's only hypocritical in the sense that it defies reality.
Let's see, without saying anything that's going to get my channel deleted, can you say anything about what happened in the last 3 years with COVID? And did you consider that a culture that rose and kind of fell already? And does that have any relevance to what's going to happen to climate? Maybe waking people up to science that can be bad? What do you think?
There are some useful lessons that are across both domains, but the COVID thing wasn't a culture in itself. Unfortunately, cultural instincts aren't the only ones that can bypass our rationality. And there are other big ones that can do it as well. And one of them is that a lot of animals socially distance. And it's instinctive and it's severe. They'll do it to the point of not saving their colleague animals, if they're going to die from something. Well, they would have, when social distancing wasn't in place, they would have saved them, and they won't. They can even kill the ones who they think have got the disease. And it's instinctive. These animals aren't rational. They haven't sort of seen on the telly and heard the Prime Minister saying, well, we need to stay indoors. It's a deep instinct. And I actually think just because we've got a veneer of civilization, we have not left that instinct behind. So I think rather than the initial thing happening being cultural, then I think a lot of it was to do with the fact that we socially distanced as animals. And I think you can see that by looking at all the polls. A lot of the governments, including our own, weren't originally going to do any of the things they did. They had a plan, and that plan had quite reasonable things in it. But as soon as the pictures on TV came of the Italian hospitals overflowing and people dying in the corridors, and the whole population became afraid, then it wasn't the government locking down the population that's unwilling. It was the government doing what the population wanted, which was desperately to do more and more to stop stuff. And so I think you can see that all the way through the story, because the distancing will only unhook itself again when people stop being afraid. I haven't bothered to check the polls now because it's kind of gone now. But back even at the beginning of this year, sort of February time, January time, then the majority of the UK population still think that lockdown was the right thing, a big majority, and they would be happy to do it again. Maybe we've moved on from there, but that just shows you, because at that, last January, February, we already knew a lot about how inappropriate a lot of these things were. But I think what happened is the social distancing instinct set off a chain of events. But what actually happens after that is that cultures, especially as the social distancing thing is ramping down, and governments have plunged into it because it's an easy way of virtue signaling, and they seem to be doing the right thing. And all the media were stoking them on to lock down more, or why did you go on this train when you could have killed people? It's all, what actually happens then is cultures they look at the long game. For instance, climate catastrophism, which at first the COVID thing probably harmed it, but cultures are extremely good at taking opportunistic things like COVID and turning it around and say, okay, wow, now maybe I can make use of all these distancing things or all these special rules because they were brought in for COVID, but maybe the culture can use them. And cultural positions adapt. So obviously in America, particularly the left will put their wagon onto the COVID measures, and the right typically resisted more. So cultural positions then take it up. But I think there is a lot to be learned about how the science can go wrong. and a lot of it is cultural, but in the later stages, because the culture had adopted positions. But I think the first thing, the first flame, the first fire, I actually think that was just animal social distancing.
Okay, let's see. Andrew Montford is your editor for this book, right? And he wrote a really good article called "Climate Change is a Doomsday Cult That Threatens Us All." So I'll put a link to that in the show description. But one thing he wrote in there is most adherents of a culture have never even read the core texts around which the culture has formed. You want to expand on that at all?
Yeah. So he's referring to, for instance, the Bible for Christianity. I mean, even back in the day, the great majority of the population hadn't read any of it. I mean, they sat and listened to it, a load of it in sermons, and originally it wasn't even in English, so they certainly couldn't understand it then. And even after it was translated to English, they might know a few popular snippets and in hymns and what have you, but they have no idea what the core tenets of the narrative actually is. The justifications, if you like, that's all shrouded in mystery, if preferably. The culture likes to shroud stuff in mystery. That's why it took so long to get the Bible written, in English instead of Latin. And it was only when Henry VIII and whatever decided we were going to have our own brand of religion for political reasons that we make any progress on that. And in the climate case, similarly, none of the, if you go out and ask a just stop oil guy or whatever, what was it all about? How much carbon dioxide is there? How much is it going up? What is the damage going to be for this amount of fuel we're going to burn? None of them will have a Scooby, as we say. I don't know how that translates, but they will not have any idea, and then they're only taking the culture at its emotive face value, like, we're all doomed and we've got to do this, this, and this to stop being doomed. They have no clue what the core tenets is. The equivalent of the Bible is I mean, I don't even know you can point to the equivalent of the Bible, because if you point to the IPC working group papers, they actually don't say there's going to be a catastrophe. I think the equivalent of the Bible is more I'd say it's the press releases of the UN and the presidents. And so in chapter 5, there's a whole load of quotes from those guys, which are complete catastrophe narrative quotes. And there's all sorts of variants, like no planet B. That's a no planet B. Well, it physically means there's no more planets than planet Earth. It's not emotive. But what it really means for anybody in the culture is like, there's no planet B. When we're fucked, we can't move to it. I don't know whether you might have to edit that out. So, so I guess the Bible is really the collection of those quotes, the collection of the prophets like Al Gore, the sayings of Al Gore, and the sayings of Greta. I guess that, but even, the more complicated stuff, how, even at the level of the people who believe there's a problem, but still bow to some of the science. I don't think any of the ordinary believers have the first idea about any of the science at all.
Yeah, Andrew Montford said in that same article, a statement of belief in the climate catastrophe narrative is therefore not a rational, considered opinion. It is simply a way of signaling to other people that you are a member of the climate club. And it sounds like what I have also concluded, there's enormous amounts of groupthink involved here, and almost no rational person could look at the evidence and say, oh no, the weather's getting worse and the CO2 is the reason. So do you agree that, could you call it some of this groupthink as well?
Yeah, a culture. I mean, a great way to think of a culture is like groupthink writ large. It's monster groupthink. I mean, I usually do it the other way around. When I talk about groupthink, I say it's culture writ small. So groupthink, you can have a groupthink in your local tennis club, maybe, or something. The committee won't let in, this and that sort of person. So a culture is like groupthink on a galactic scale. It's groupthink with 1 billion people, and so indeed it is. Your statements of belief, and the whole idea, the whole reason for these narratives existing from our evolutionary past. The only reason they exist is to keep everybody in a group. So that's their job. Their job is to keep everybody in a group. But if you say everybody's going in a group, there must be an out group. So you can't define a group without having an out group. So there's a boundary around the group. And everybody inside are those who say the right things, do the right things. So I believe the planet's going to die unless we get rid of fossil fuels. I believe this, I believe that. And that's what Andrew meant. It's like these statements of belief, they're just your flags to say you're in the club. And anybody who doesn't say those things is automatically out group. And that's what the group does. It has to, because you can't get group benefits, because the group benefits are your survival. You know, people in the past, you might not get fed if you didn't believe in the church or something, you know, and you might get killed if you believe in the wrong religion, but you can't access the group benefits, and the group doesn't want you to access the benefits unless they know that you're sound. So you've got to put your hand up and say, I'm sound, I believe in this, and then you're in the club. And the guys who don't put their hand up and say that, or raise a perfectly legitimate question, well, it doesn't matter whether the question is rational or not, that's irrelevant. It's not a group question. We don't ask those questions. And that's why none of it is rational. It's all about, are you in the club or are you not? And I think some extreme versions of this, you can actually get heresies inside the club. Sometimes if the heresies get too big, the club might split in two. It's not happened for climate catastrophism yet. But for instance, Protestantism and Catholicism split. And you got quite close to a split on nuclear. Because at one point, is it, I can't remember her first name, Oreskes?
Naomi, right?
Naomi Oreskes said that James Hansen was a different kind of climate denier because he believed in nuclear. And, you know, that's the sort of level of which you get of the irrationality of this stuff. You know, she's put the label on him. She doesn't like nuclear. She's in the very millenarian wing. He's only in like half millenarian wing. You know, he actually thinks you could solve it. And so that's why these labels are planted, to see who's in the group and who's not, and to keep the group tight. And you know, we have a word for that. We call it singing off the same hymn sheet. And the reason we use that phrase is because that was literally how it happened for the religious cultures. If you weren't singing the same hymn, you weren't in the right group, right? So you can't go around singing any Catholic hymns anymore. Once we split off and got our own branch, you've got to sing Protestant hymns. And so at the moment, most of catastrophism is singing the same hymns, but there's a sort of discordant bunch who are quite fancying nuclear, and that could lead to a schism.
In your book, a lot of times you mention something called innate skepticism, and I think I'm seeing that in basically everybody, because basically no one can be bothered to live as if they actually believe that CO2 emissions are going to kill their kids. So do you want to talk about that, innate skepticism? Yeah.
There's, I think this is one of the, most of the stuff in my book is not original. You know, this stuff comes from other people's research. I've put it together. The one thing I might have brought to the party that's a little bit different is innate skepticism, because most people think that if you disbelieve a culture, then it must be because you believe in a different one. So you don't believe in Dem Lib culture because you're a rep con person, right? But it's not necessarily the case. That can happen, but there is also an instinctive distrust of any culture. So if you didn't believe in any culture, your default skepticism is on. So you might disbelieve in stuff even if you don't believe in its opposite. You're not disbelieving it because you believe in its opposite. You just disbelieve it because you can detect it's a cultural narrative. And how people detect that is really interesting. So an analogy is, people know how to detect liars. There's an endless war between, there's an evolutionary race between lying and detecting lies, lying and detecting lies, going up and up and up. But people kind of know. So, and you know, it's nowadays it's studied, of course. So people see about it on the movies, and the FBI checking out liars, and and so you know, the people sweat more, or they're a bit nervous, or their hand might shake a bit, or their eyes twitch, or they don't look at you. You know, they're looking over here. Yeah, this is really true. And you know, and all these things get worse if they're given some other cognitive task that occupies them. Then they've got less cognitive ability to try and control their signals, and they leak out more. So when you're trying to detect a lie, you often give them a task to do, and then run the questions by them, and it gets worse because they get more twitchy. So the interesting thing about these signals that you can use to detect somebody's lying. I mean, if it's a professional liar, you know, it might get past you. So you could have false, you could not detect it, and you might get false positives too. But you have got something, and you can use it statistically to pick out liars more often than not. But the great thing about this is you don't have to have any knowledge whatsoever of the subject being lied about. So, you know, somebody might be lying about a rail timetable, you know, oh, this train goes here, whatever, you know, and you don't know anything about it, rail timetable, but you can still tell they're lying because they have these signals. And so the innate skepticism is the group level version of the same signals. So, so detection of individual lying. So an individual is detecting an individual lie. At the group level, an individual is detecting a group lie. So it's still an individual at the detective ends. He's still got his clues to do it. But the deception is now a group deception. The group deception is the narratives that cultures put out that are always wrong. Remember, I said they are always wrong. If it's a group deception, it's always wrong. And so the way you detect them is you can't use the clues for individual lying because the people are believing it honestly. If they honestly believe it, they're not lying. And this is another reason why we know most people aren't lying. They don't have the slightest symptoms of lying. In fact, they look usually like they've found, you know, the greatest passion of their life or whatever. But there are signals, and the signals are: is the consensus too rigid, too perfect? You know, does it brook no argument whatsoever? So you can't ask even relevant questions. You know, there's a list of them in the book. And I can't remember the list, but there's a couple. There are some more, and effectively, you know, is this thing too certain? Is it unquestionable? Those sorts of things. And if people instinctively see those, they know it's a culture, because only cultures do that. Unfortunately, it can occasionally misfire, because one problem is that a scientific consensus, which is true not because it's an agreed consensus, it's because you can do the experiment anywhere in the world and it's true, then it looks to some people, if your values don't align, then it looks to some people like a cultural consensus, and that's when people disbelieve science wrongly. So innate skepticism can sometimes be apt. It correctly detects a culture using these clues, and it can sometimes be inapt, in which it incorrectly detects a culture. And the thing is made worse because sometimes correct science, so like when we colonized Africa and places, then we pushed correct science about medicine and so on, but we pushed it as a part of Christian culture. So a lot of it was rejected by the natives, not because they thought that the medicine was bad, but because they detected it was being pushed by a culture. So that's the case where you've got correct science wrapped up in a culture. Somebody who is innately skeptical of that is actually aptly innately skeptical. They correctly detected the culture, even though correct science was in the middle of that culture somewhere, but they correctly detected the culture and rejected it. And just like most of the belief across publics in climate catastrophism is emotive, then most of the disbelief is innate skepticism. It's instinctive. They know it's a culture. They can see it's a culture. And that's another reason why you get these big switches between unconstrained questions where they might believe it, but when it goes to reality, they think, no, I'm not deeply, my alliance for this culture is only shallow, and I'm pulling out when it gets deep, and they switch. And it's because what's happened is in the unconstrained question case, if their religion has an alliance with climate catastrophe, the Pope says we're all going to die because of climate change, so that's enough to have a shallow alliance, and so that actually disables their innate skepticism. So when they see an unconstrained question, they don't have innate skepticism because the Pope's told them it's cool. But when it switches to a reality constrained one, then their real heavy values, the things they really believe in, start to matter. Innate skepticism depends on what values you have. And those religious values mean they're going to be innately skeptical of a competitor. And that's why it changes completely between the two. So I hope I've brought something to the party with innate skepticism. I mean, most people think of skepticism as being rational. I mean, if you Mike Shermer, head of the Skeptic Society, has often has statements like science and skepticism are synonymous. But unfortunately, that's bound to lead to conflation. If you've got on, if the vast majority of skepticism is in fact instinctive, then that is really going to confuse things. And I think most people are very confused when they see people being skeptical. They think, well, they're either they might confuse it with rational skepticism, or they might confuse it with belief in an opposing culture. But it could be neither. It's just instinctive skepticism because you've twigged the clues.
Okay, we're coming up on an hour here. Do you have other points you'd like to make before we finish up?
No. I think you've covered the ground pretty well. I think the one I struggle with is what the hell are we going to do about it? But I guess maybe the only thing I'll say is if we don't understand what we're facing, you have no chance of defeating it. The GWPS, for instance, the wonderful guys who published my book, I'm eternally grateful. But they spent a lot of years fighting the science, like arguing about the science. It's nothing to do with the science. It hasn't been anything to do with the science for decades. The culture has a life of its own, and it's going where it's going. And it's not, you need to fight. The way to fight it, I think, is to make clear as the cost of fuel these days and things, make clear reality. Cultures do not like reality. You've got to force reality in its face. And it's the downstream things, the things that actually happen. It's nothing to do with climate science. And you're fighting the wrong thing if you think that. What you're fighting is a religion, and you have to use the same tools that you might use to fight a religion. So I think that's the one thing I would say. You've got to be fighting the right thing.
All right, very good. Thank you for doing this. Andy West, I will talk to you next time.
Fantastic. Cheers.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.